So I just want to start by thanking for the invitation to come and speak today. I'll explain my background because it is relevant because I've got two hats. I'm here as a healthcare professional, but I'm also a patient. So I will explain all of that. So I'll explain how I got here, how I ended up working in this field, why I think nutrition is so important, and I've specifically focused on hypermobile EDS and hypermobility spectrum disorder. What do we need to consider and what do we need to consider next? So my background is I'm a pharmacist by background. I originally started my career in community pharmacy, and then after a few years in that, I went back to university to study for an MSc in clinical pharmacy, and then I moved into primary care, working in general practice, advising GPs on prescribing. And then I did that for about 5 years, and then for another 5 years after that, I managed a team of pharmacists who did that role in primary care. And then I moved into a spell in clinical commissioning in a primary care trust, working in planned care, service redesign, and whilst doing that role, I went back to university again to study for an MSc in Nutritional Medicine. And about a year into my Nutritional Medicine MSc, I left the NHS and I set up my own business working in consultancy at the interface between the pharmaceutical industry and the NHS, and that's a role that I still do. So then, about a year into my new self-employed role, I developed a really severe headache that accompanied with all kinds of other unusual symptoms, nausea, some hearing loss in my left ear. The longer I was upright, the more unwell I felt, and I realised that when I went to lie down, the symptoms massively reduced. And to cut a very long story short, after an 8-night stay in my local hospital, I was diagnosed with a spontaneous spinal cerebrospinal fluid leak. And I'd never heard of that condition. I'd heard of all kinds of other types of headache. As a pharmacist, I studied most types of primary causes of headache. I'd never heard of this condition. Basically what this is that somewhere in your spinal area, a hole or a tear develops in the dura that surrounds your brain and spinal cord. And when you're upright, the fluid leaks away, and under gravity, your brain sags inside your head, which is what causes all of the symptoms that go with the condition. So I was told that there was a possibility that this could just heal naturally, and that the best course of action would be conservative management, to just go home, lie down, and if it didn't heal by itself, then I would need to go back to hospital for a procedure to help seal the leak. But they couldn't find the leak on imaging, so they wouldn't know where to start in terms of trying to treat it. So I thought, well, it's worth a try to have some conservative bed rest. So I went home to lie down, and over the next few weeks, I spent a lot of time on my iPhone. That should be a picture of somebody with an iPhone, just reading from the libraries of the world. Because I was studying a nutritional medicine MSc, I had access to all kinds of literature, medical journals, and I started to read, why had I got this condition? Why had this happened? And I came across an article, a journal paper, which said that this condition often happens in people who have an underlying connective tissue disorder, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or Marfan syndrome. And I'd never heard of either of these conditions. So first I went to Google and Googled Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and went to the EDS Support UK website. And when I read the list of symptoms, I just thought, wow, I have this condition. This explains virtually everything that's ever been wrong with me for my entire life. Explains my joint dislocations since I was a little girl. It explains my musculoskeletal pains that wax and wane. It explains my gastrointestinal dysfunction, my autonomic dysfunction, and a whole host of allergy-type symptoms, a history of migraines, you name it, I'd had the entire list. So then I wondered, well, what is this condition? Why do people get sick? What's going on? So I read this on the EDS UK website, which says that the cause is unknown, but we think that it's probably something to do with collagen and connective tissues, and it appears to be inherited, and so it looks like there's a genetic cause. But I'd been sitting in lectures for the last 3 years studying nutritional medicine, where nutrition academics kept using this phrase, genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And there are lots and lots of conditions that have got a genetic component to them, where people inherit a gene, but they never develop the condition. And there are lots and lots of illnesses where we know that you can develop a genetic predisposition, and then there is an environmental trigger that pushes you into symptoms and illness. So I wondered if that was what was going on in hypermobile EDS. So I started to read a little bit more about the condition, and I started to read other people's accounts. I read Fragile Links, I read various other articles that people had written on EDS UK, and I started to see that there was this pattern, and this is obviously what is described in the literature as well, that often there's this period in early life of joint hypermobility or healthy hypermobile. People often describe, I was an athlete, I was a dancer, I was a gymnast, I was this, I was that, the other, and I was okay, and then something happened. And there are two main ways, if I just move the pointer. So there are some people that describe this. So they were really healthy, and then they got to puberty, and gradually things got worse and worse and worse. By the time they got their 20s, they felt they were actually quite disabled. And then there were another group that described this, where, again, healthy, may be quite a long time, maybe only a few years in early life, and then something happened, got glandular fever, had an operation, never recovered. And so it seemed that kind of fit with my idea. I had no prior experience of working with these patients. I had no other experience other than my own experience, which was I probably had a period in early life for about 4 years where I was probably healthy hypermobile, and I had my first joint dislocation around about the time when I started to get gastrointestinal problems at about the age of 4. So that kind of fit with my own experience as well. And so then I asked this question, well, this hypothesis is, if this happens, if it's a genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger, and you can go from being healthy hypermobile to then having symptoms and lots of comorbidities with it, is it possible to go back the other way? Is it possible, by changing in the environment, to go back to being healthy hypermobile? So I asked myself these questions. Because I was studying nutritional medicine, I took the environmental part of that trigger as being nutrition, as being a big part of that. And these were the questions that I asked. So what are the dietary components that are needed to support optimum collagen and connective tissue synthesis? Which dietary components might damage my collagen and connective tissues? What might be causing the associated symptoms? Which nutrients might be needed for those associated symptoms? So which food should I eat more of? Which food should I avoid? And should I take any nutrient supplements? So I then put myself on this N=1 experiment, started tweaking things, experimenting with my diet, changing things gradually. Some things were very minor changes, others were a bit more drastic. And gradually, over a period of about 3 to 6 months, virtually every symptom that I've described to you either massively reduced or subsided altogether. Nobody was more shocked than me. And I carried on reading and researching and trying to understand what was going on. And did anybody else? What was in the literature about this? And a few months into my N=1 experiment, I came across this, which is a talk. If you haven't watched this, it's available online. I would highly recommend that you do, which is by Dr. Heidi Collins in the USA. If you can't connect the issues, think connective tissues. And partway into her presentation, she talks about nutrition and the importance of nutrition. And when I got to that point, I just burst into tears because it was finally, wow, somebody else thinks the same way I do. We're on different continents and we've reached the same conclusion ourselves. Heidi also has EDS. She uses this in her own life. And she also introduced me to this phrase, this Hickham's dictum: patients can have as many diseases as they damn well please. There's not just the EDS, you can develop all kinds of other things. And as we've already heard about the different comorbidities that can develop alongside the underlying genetic issue. And as part of my nutritional medicine MSc, I'd learned about this, which is to do with how we learn or how we set dietary requirements for a population. And this here is a normal distribution curve. And in the middle here, you've got the average requirement, which is what most of the population will need in order to stay healthy. Some people at this end will need a lot more of a nutrient in order to stay healthy, and people at this end won't need very much at all, and they can get away with a diet that isn't very nutritious and still stay healthy. And so I thought, well, I wonder, does our genetic predisposition put us in this end here, that we actually need more of a nutrient in order to stay healthy? And Heidi, again, also introduced me to this concept of, are we the canaries in the coal mine of the typical Western diet? Does a diet that's poor in nutrition affect us more than somebody else that's at this end of this graph? And so that kind of also fit with my ideas and my own personal experiences. And then, of course, in 2017, we've got the new classification, which also describes this idea that there's a spectrum that you can move along from being healthy on one end to being quite unwell at the other. But again, I ask the question, is it possible to go back the other way? Is it a one-way street that only takes you to worsening of symptoms? My own personal experience is that it is possible to go back the other way. So then, questions that I've been asked with regards to this and my ideas and what's going on is that, you know, the faulty genes mean I can only make faulty collagen and I can't change my genes. It's all in my genes. There is no cure, but it's a genetic disorder, so how can nutrition help? And if diet could help, why isn't it already out there? Something seems so obvious. Why hasn't it been implemented and actioned already? And also, people often ask me, what do I eat? So this, again, has been part of my Nutritional Medicine MSc. These are in new branches of science, relatively new, very much in their infancy. Epigenetics, so Professor Tim Spector has written that book, which is called Identically Different, Why You Can Change Your Genes. And that's all about the studies that have been done in twins that show that actually different twins can develop very different illnesses. And then there's also this book here, The Epigenetics Revolution, which gives a fantastic analogy, which is to do with our genetic code isn't necessarily a blueprint, like it's a set of instructions to build a building. We should think of it more as being like a script for a movie or a play. And just as if you had a bunch of actors and a director creating a Hollywood version of a Shakespeare play, it would look very different to one by the Royal Shakespeare Company in London. But it's the same script, it's the same words, it's the same Shakespeare, but actually the actors and the directors and the scene and everything else would create quite a different product at the end. And also there's nutrigenomics and epigenomics, which are very new branches of science, which are looking at how can what we eat switch our genes on and off and make them work differently. So is that part of the story? So I also looked at this, which is specifically in joint hypermobility in the twins. Professor Tim Spector was involved in that with Dr. Hakim, which showed that even in identical twins, only 60% of identical twins are both hypermobile. So if it was all totally about genes, you'd surely expect that to be much higher, closer to 100%. But there is a difference, there seems to be, and even in their conclusion, they say it's yet to be determined whether there are specific environmental or genetic factors that increase the development of such disorders in the hypermobility population. So we don't know yet. This is often used as well. There is no cure, but most long-term conditions, there's no cure. As a pharmacist, I know that, as you know, dispensing medicines for years and years and years for patients. Asthma is another condition that's got a genetic component to it. It runs in families. Atopic disease, asthma, eczema, and hay fever often run concurrently. They run in families. But we don't tend to call asthma as being a genetic disorder with no cure. We describe it in terms of a long-term condition which can be managed with avoidance of triggers. And even in the British Thoracic Society sign guideline, in the non-pharmacological part of that, they do say that, that from observational studies, a high intake of fresh fruit and vegetables can result in better pulmonary function. So there is definitely, you know, an environmental component there. And also this, EDS is a genetic disorder, so how can nutrition help? Well, again, another example of something that's genetic is height. It runs in families. Anybody who's been a parent, who's had a red book for their child, would have been able to see in the back of the book there's a calculation that you can do. You plug in father's height, you plug in mother's height, you do a little calculation, and you decide, it shows you how tall your child is expected to be. But we know from studies that if you're zinc deficient at a key point in your growth, you can end up not being as tall as you were destined to be. And we also know from studies that if you give supplementation of zinc when somebody is deficient, it can cause height growth catch-up. So again, although it's genetic, there's an environmental interplay there. And then there's another disease, Wilson's disease, which is described as a genetic disorder that results in a buildup of copper in the body. But that's treated with medication and dietary changes. So even though it's a genetic disorder, it's managed with dietary changes, with chelating agents, with zinc supplements, in order to reduce copper in the diet. So the other question is, well, if it's just as simple as a diet, why hasn't it been done already? Why is there nothing in the literature? And when I've started to look to see what is in the literature, in terms of EDS experts, nobody's yet done any research on the impact of nutrition, only looked at it in terms of what might be possible. And in terms of nutrition experts, none of them are researching EDS. And it is really complex. It's not straightforward. It took me a lot of trial and error over quite a significant number of months, and that was with somebody that was studying nutritional medicine. So this is not easy. It's not a case of just eat that and you'll be fine. It's really not easy. So when I was looking in the literature to see what I could find, there was the first nutritional hypothesis paper was published in 2005. The idea there was, it was suggested that because a lot of the symptoms that people with EDS experience look like nutritional deficiencies, maybe supplementations might help. Then nothing was done with that at all, no experimental testing of that hypothesis. And then in 2015, this was a few months after I had effectively learned how to manage my symptoms with diet. This paper came out by Marco Castori, whose name I'm sure you're all familiar with because he's written a lot of papers in EDS. And this group comes up with this conclusion: nutritional supplementations together with other lifestyle interventions are likely to become a centerpiece of the future prevention and perhaps treatment approach to joint hypermobility stroke EDSHT, as it was called back then. And when I read that, I did a happy dance around my kitchen. It was like, wow, there's somebody else on the same page as me and in the EDS community. Hopefully, we might be on the right track. But there are loads of gaps in our knowledge. We don't know. There have been no studies done to look at the incidence of nutrient deficiencies in the EDS population. That's a tweet from EDS UK. Dr. Henderson, who's written the neurology paper for the new classification, who's a neurosurgeon in the USA, has quoted most EDS patients we've tested have had vitamin deficiencies. We know, we've already heard from Dr. Kaz, there's been such a dearth of research in this field, and that's a quote from Professor Graham, which I'm sure a lot of you have already heard. No other disease in the history of modern medicine has been neglected in such a way. It is really complex, and there's nobody working in this. So I just want to start to scratch the surface a little bit. As I've said, it is really, really complex, and I'm not going to stand up here today and say to you it's as easy as just doing X, Y, Z, because it's really not. But I just want to think about this to begin with, okay? So hypermobile EDS symptoms. It's a heritable disorder, weakened connective tissues, fatigue, post-exertional malaise, easy bruising, occasional or recurrent joint pains, wound healing defects, sometimes keratosis pilaris, which is bumpy skin, bumpy little lumps on your skin, sometimes anxiety disorders and depression, which we've already heard about, bleeding gums, sometimes leading to tooth loss. If you look at what vitamin C deficiency symptoms are, impaired collagen synthesis, weakened connective tissues, fatigue, malaise, easy bruising, joint pain, poor wound healing, hyperkeratosis and corkscrew hairs, which looks a lot like keratosis pilaris, depression, inflammation of the gums, and tooth loss. So there's a massive overlap there between what we experience with hypermobile EDS and what a vitamin deficiency looks like. Then we've got nutrient deficiencies that present themselves with gastrointestinal symptoms. So iron deficiency anemia can affect your sense of taste, can give you a sore mouth, open sores at the side of your mouth, difficulty swallowing. Sound familiar? Other symptoms include cognitive function problems, problems with the immune function, impaired exercise or work performance, and body temperature regulation. And people who are at risk are people with an inadequate dietary intake. Well, gastrointestinal symptoms can influence your dietary intake. Pregnancy, heavy menstrual bleeding, it's females who are affected. People who have gastrointestinal disorders and surgery, proton pump inhibitors, so you get symptoms, you put on a proton pump inhibitor like omeprazole, lansoprazole, pantoprazole, and they can inhibit the absorption of iron. So you may end up with some symptoms, you put on a drug, then you get an iron deficiency as well. Magnesium is another one, another nutrient. So signs and symptoms of magnesium deficiency, loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, constipation. Sound familiar? Also, muscle cramps, tremor, fatigue, numbness, tingling, weakness, headaches, heart rate abnormalities, seizures, and depression. Again, individuals at risk, dietary intake, GI disorders, type 2 diabetes, alcohol problems, proton pump inhibitors, again, inhibit absorption of magnesium. Thiamine, vitamin B1, symptoms include nausea, vomiting, weight loss, poor appetite, constipation, sound familiar? Confusion, short-term memory loss, muscle weakness, stiffness, leg cramps, and fatigue. Again, people at risk, poor dietary intake, high carbohydrate diet, which again we've also heard with POTS, that can influence symptoms there as well. But high carbohydrate diet actually results in your body using up thiamine. You use more thiamine to process carbohydrates. People with diabetes are at risk. People who've undergone weight loss surgery, it's to do with how the body absorbs it. High alcohol intake and alcohol dependence, because those use up thiamine, and alcohol uses up thiamine in its metabolism, and older people are also at risk. Vitamin B12, again, symptoms, constipation, loss of appetite, weight loss, soreness of the mouth and tongue, fatigue, weakness, neurological changes such as numbness, tingling in the hands and feet, difficulty in maintaining balance, depression, poor memory, and confusion. Again, all symptoms that go with the comorbidities. Again, at risk, GI disease, GI surgery, following a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. And again, people try and manage symptoms. They change their diet in order to see if they can help with that. Again, pregnant breastfeeding, and proton pump inhibitors again also inhibit the absorption of vitamin B12. And then vitamin D, the symptoms of deficiency in vitamin D. Lots of us become vitamin D deficient in the winter because we can only make vitamin D in the summer. We have to get it from our diet otherwise in the winter, or from a supplement. Signs and symptoms, musculoskeletal pain, bone pain. Lots of children are put down with growing pains in children. But we also use a lot of sunblock in children. You know, a lot of schools tell you in letters you can't send your child in the summer unless they've got a T-shirt and a hat and sunblock. So there's a lot less exposure than there might have been in previous generations. Darker skin tones also increase risk. Low dietary intakes. All through the winter, we can't make vitamin D from the sun at all in the Northern Hemisphere in the UK. So we have to get it from our diet in the winter, or with a top-up from a supplement, which is now recommended for a lot of at-risk groups for the winter. And then there are other conditions as well. If you've got kidney problems, you may not be able to convert into vitamin D into its active form. And then also anything that affects the absorption in your gut, which a lot of people with EDS have got gastrointestinal symptoms. If there's fat malabsorption for any reason, then vitamin D won't be absorbed from food so easily either. So after hearing all of that, if you think you've got any nutrient deficiencies at all, then you need to talk to somebody, doctor, pharmacist, dietitian, or nutritionist. Don't just supplement with things without checking it out first, or at least discussing it with somebody. Because sometimes too much of a supplement is not necessarily a good thing. So also people ask me, what do I eat? Well, I don't think it's as easy as me standing up here and saying my N=1 experiment is applicable to all of you, because I don't think it is. We need to do some research first to find out which patients can respond to this. We don't know who will or won't. It's really not straightforward, and some of it will need to be tailored slightly according to allergies, intolerances, and things like that. So what I'm now doing is I work with Professor Aziz at the Wingate Institute of Neurogastroenterology, and I see patients with him at his clinic at the Royal London Hospital. And we are designing some research studies to try and test this to see if it is reproducible in other people. So I'm not going to be sharing anything online or anything anywhere about what a diet should look like until we've got some research evidence to show that it can work in anybody other than me. And on that note, we have now, and you may have seen it if you're a member of EDS UK, a letter came out at Christmas time about we're specifically looking for fundraising initiatives. There is now a place on the EDS UK website where donations can be made specifically for diet research in EDS. So in the meantime, until we've got some clear evidence from research studies, I would say diet is important, nutrition is important. We can develop all kinds of other things on top of the underlying original problem that's going on there. And so food is really important for all of us. So these are my main tips. So shop around the aisles and not in them. So go back to shopping the way that your granny, great-granny, great-great-granny would have shopped at the individual shops, greengrocer, butcher, fishmonger, and try and avoid all that long-life processed junk in the middle aisles. Just get real foods again back on your plate. And linked to that, eat from the fridge and not from the cupboards, because if you have to keep it in the fridge, it goes off quickly, it's probably fresh foods. If it sits in the cupboards, it can be there for ages, it's probably not got very many nutrients in it, it's long life. Every meal should have a rainbow of natural colour. You should have at least 3, if not 5 colours on your plate on every meal. Eat more vegetables than a vegetarian. I can't stress how important vegetables are. They're a massive source of vitamin C. All vegetables have got vitamin C in. That's really important for collagen synthesis. And make every mouthful count. You know, I work with Professor Aziz. I see people all the time who've got really severe gastrointestinal symptoms. I'm not saying this is easy, but if you can tolerate some foods orally, make sure that every mouthful counts. Snacking on biscuits, cakes, sweets and things at the time where you feel like you can tolerate something is not going to give you any nutrition at all. And that's put some love in your tummy. That's what I call myself on Twitter. But I think that it's really important, actually, that we need to think that everything that we eat, every cell in our body, every structure in our body comes from what we eat. And if we don't get the right nutrition in, we can't replenish cells that are damaged, broken, wound healing, post-operative, all those kinds of things all rely on good nutrition. So what next? Well, as I've already mentioned, we need lots and lots of research in this field. We still don't know what causes hypermobility spectrum disorder or hypermobile EDS. We've got lots of ideas about and things that can help, and I'm sure in the next 2 days there are loads and loads of other lifestyle things that I use in my life as well, various other lifestyle things that can help beyond nutrition. But we do need to try and understand what can help in terms of diet and nutrition in HSD and hypermobile EDS. So we need diet studies. But we also need nutrient supplement studies, because there will be some people that will need nutrient supplements to bring them back to a level that is a normal function. We also need those epidemiological studies to see, does that hypothesis that I've described, does that actually happen across a person's lifetime, where we've got some studies already that show there is often this period of healthy hypermobile and then things progress from there. What does that look like in terms of the full, can it go back the other way? We need the epigenetics, nutrigenomics, nutri-epigenomic studies to know what's going on at a cellular level. Are we switching genes on and off? Is that working? Is that helping? Is that what's working here? We need to keep an open mind, and we need a lot of hope, because I do genuinely, the only reason I'm standing here today is because I have found how much this has helped my life. I didn't even work in this field at all. In 2014, I'd never even heard of this condition. But I decided that actually I could either just use this to manage my own symptoms for the rest of my life, or I could actually try and do something about helping other people to learn about it as well. But we can't do that without research studies, which is why I didn't go down the route of blogging about it and all of that until we've got some proper evidence. And the reason that I put that in there is because my entire view of everything that I've ever known as a pharmacist and as a patient has changed completely in terms of how I see things now. Previously I would have managed things with medicines. Now when I listen to people talk about their symptoms, I hear nutrient deficiencies, and I hear the sequence of events that may have happened that is to do with an environmental trigger that's against the background of the genetic predisposition. And I also wanted to put this in because going right back to over 2,000 years ago, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, and all disease begins in the gut. I think he had it right. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. That was a journal cover that Professor Aziz's group did recently about this. We know that gastrointestinal symptoms are very prominent in people with hypermobility disorders. And so, yeah, there does need to be a lot more research to show this. So just some acknowledgements. All my tutors from the University of Surrey, without whom I wouldn't have been able to piece all of this together. Professor Aziz for inviting me into his research team. Dr. Heidi Collins, who also has arrived at the same as me. Professor Rodney Graham, who helped introduce me to Professor Aziz after he diagnosed me. EDS UK, Hypermobility Syndromes Association, Ehlers-Danlos Society as well. Laura Bloom was quite key in the beginning also to introduce me to various people. And also all the people who've shared their story publicly. That was massive in my learning initially. And I've put that there because comedy has been a big part of when I was lying down for 3 months, I had no idea when I was going to get better. And as we've already heard, anxiety, mood, all of those things, they can be quite difficult, but comedy was a big part of what helped me get through those days. And I put that in there because that is literally what it felt like when I read that list of symptoms for hypermobile EDS, and I had my own eureka moment. So thank you very much.